The Old Woods, written and narrated by the Crooked Rook. The old forest, the codger had said. Ain't no guide foolhardy enough to take you out there. The aged man stroked his beard and rubbed his bald head. He leaned forward on the tavern table, sliding his empty mug aside. You hear things, though, you know. Stories and the like. Men who go hunting there, they say men go mad after only a single night in the old forest. Or come back not quite right. Some say they don't come back at all, and something else comes back in their place. He leaned back again. However you like it, ain't no one gonna take you to the old forest who knows what's good for 'em. Peck had heard the stories. Everyone had, even as far out as Bridgewater, where he came from. His own father had told him stories. Hearsay, as he had never been there himself. But those weren't the only tales of the old forest. Folks said things grew bigger there in the ancient parts of the woods. Bears as large as elephants, stags with antlers that could pass for a full tree. Peck had caught glimpses of the trees there in his earlier hunts. They grew tall, taller than any he had back home. The trunks were at least 8 arm spans around, and at least 100 high. But as he sat with his back against one of those trees, Peck could hardly recall what had ever been worth enough to draw him into this place. Everything did grow larger here, including the shadows. Peck sat with his back to a tree, his small campfire providing too little protection from the unknown behind him. The crickets chirped all around him, and every so often a twig snapped in the distance, causing his eyes to shoot open and his blood to run cold. And then, he could hear the snuffling of some large animal. Some very large animal. The sounds drew closer to his camp. The crickets went silent. His breath caught in his throat as he made out the sound of footfalls. It sounded enormous. And with each step, it only drew closer. He drew his knife and held it close. It was right beside his tree. He could feel its hot breath on his leg. It sniffed and snuffled again. Peck rushed forward and seized a branch from his campfire, whipping around to face the animal. As he held the burning branch in front of him, he could just barely make out the shape of a bear. On all fours, it was already close to his height. It raised itself on its hind legs, and Peck involuntarily took a step back. It was now easily a full 3 heads taller than him. He had never seen a bear even close to that height before. The branch in his hand crackled. He took a deep breath and tensed his shoulders, waiting to see how the bear would react. The bear grunted, then roared at him. Peck gripped his knife tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. His bow was on the other side of the fire, beside his satchel and the rest of his gear. He could run for the bow, but would likely not have time to loose an arrow before the bear reached him. It was only about 10 feet away from him. He was left with little alternative. Peck threw the burning branch at the bear's head and dove for his bow. The bear grunted as the branch struck it in the shoulder, then roared again at Peck. Peck straightened, bow in his hand, and fumbled with an arrow for a moment before he finally took aim. The bear hadn't moved. In fact, it wasn't looking at Peck at all. Then, a sound filled the air, starting high and descending into a low moan. At first, Peck thought it was a person screaming, but the voice was both too high and too low to have been a single person making the same sound. Upon hearing the scream, the bear hesitated, staring at something beyond the clearing. Then, it dropped down on all fours and ran back into the woods. Peck stared after the bear, brow furrowed in confusion. His breath still came quickly. "What in hell's name?" he muttered. He waited another few minutes before he moved from that spot. When he was sure the bear wasn't returning, he took a moment to stoke the fire, building it higher than before. Bow and arrow still in hand, he moved the rest of his belongings to the tree where he had rested. Opening the satchel, he made a note of everything he had brought with him. His horse, Rosebush, had stopped dead in her tracks about a mile from the first of the trees of the old forest. She would not take another step forward. Rather than press her on the issue, Peck had tied her to a tree near the stream as dusk was falling, and taken only the most necessary items with him. Another hunting party had encamped nearby, still out of sight of the old forest. They agreed to watch after her until he returned. Perhaps he should have taken her hesitation as his first sign that the old forest would not welcome him. Perhaps he had been overconfident in his abilities, thinking this would be no different than any of his previous hunts. But unless he wished to go hunt up in the Black Ridge Mountains, a full 3-week journey from home, this was the only other option left to him. He hadn't really given much credence to the legends and stories until he had seen the place himself. Needless to say, Peck did not sleep much that night in the old wood. He could hear things off in the distance. Many he recognized. There were wolves nearby. Peck even glimpsed them from time to time near the edge of that clearing, but they never drew closer than that. There was one sound in particular which he could not place. It sounded several times that night, the same sound, the scream that had scared the bear away. What could have scared off even a bear of that size? And when he did sleep, he dreamed of home. His father, now with much less strength than when Peck was a boy. He dreamed of his parting, leaving his home and his father. He had pulled Dunnell aside, gripped the young man by the shoulders. "Dunnell, you are to look after him, you hear?" Dunnell nodded. "Peck, you heard the sage talking. His strength's leaving him. What if he doesn't make it until you get back?" Peck didn't answer. He looked to the ground, letting his grip on the young man's shoulders loosen. "Peck, the sage has been asking to see him one last time, to commend his spirit." Peck gritted his teeth. His jaw clenched, and he turned away, lifting his bow from its place on the wall. If it's what he wants. Bow in hand, Peck walked to his father's bedside again. "Father, I'm headed south to Kirkhanen. I've heard hunting is still good there. I should be back within a week's time." His father stirred. "The old woods?" he whispered. Peck nodded. "Honor the woods," the sickly man said. Peck paused. He shook his head. He did not remember this part of his leaving. "No, you didn't say anything after—" He looked up and saw a pair of glowing green eyes staring at him through the cabin window. Peck started awake, bow still clasped in his hand. The first signs of dawn had begun to creep into the sky above him. That was reason enough for him to break camp. He packed up his belongings, slinging his satchel over his shoulder, and checking once again that his water skin was there, along with his tinderbox. Those were two things he could not allow himself to leave behind. Without water, he would not last long here. And without fire, there would be little to ward off the larger predators. He did not fancy the idea of encountering another bear such as the one from the previous night, especially without fire on his side. But the screams, and those green eyes from his dream. Perhaps he was simply being paranoid. He could not help but feel that there was something watching him. Peck reviewed all of the other items he had brought. Dried venison in a bundle at the bottom of the satchel, his blanket, his hatchet, a quiver, and 20 arrows. He counted them out, reviewing the fletching and the heads one by one. All were to his satisfaction. But he would still need Rosebush's help to take any sizable kill out of the woods. He checked his belt once again for his knife. His mind went back to the inhuman shriek he had heard the previous night, and his hand instinctively tightened on his bow. He did not nock an arrow, but he did scan the trees slowly, searching for something of which he was not sure his mind could conceive. It tried, of course, conjuring phantom images of wolves, bears, lions. Wolves he knew better than most. They were all too common near Bridgewater. He had been forced to fend off more than just a handful to protect a freshly killed doe as he returned home from a hunting trip. They were usually inclined to keep their distance, But deer were few and far between these days. He couldn't blame the wolves for trying. There had been fewer and fewer sightings each season for the past few years, and further south, as though the deer were receding back further and further toward the old woods. The wolves he had seen last night were different. They were not desperate like those back home. These had been curious, but had not come even as close as the bear had. Peck stopped as he neared the edge of his camp. 3 times the night before, he had heard the sound, the shriek and the moan. He had seen the bear and the wolves, but amongst the paw prints, he found another set of prints. It had been a deer. Judging by the hooves, it was indeed large, but Peck had hunted larger. It took him several moments to realize what unsettled him. Judging by the impressions in the dirt and the crushed leaves on the forest floor, the deer had walked directly up to the tree against which Peck had slept, and had walked, not run, away from the campsite. And from the depth of the impressions in the dirt, the deer had stood directly beside the tree for a long time. It had watched him as he slept. Peck tried to keep the younger trees within sight, a clear division between the old and new forests. Truly, he did, but because of the size of the trees in the old woods, this was more difficult than it sounded. Anytime he rounded one of the colossal things, he felt a surge of panic as his view of safety was obstructed. Peck felt as though he were being pulled in 2 directions. One, his wiser half, begged him to leave the forest, to return home, to fetch Rosebush and ride hard until he made it back to Bridgewater, to never look back at this place and whatever gods nurtured it. But on the other hand, food. A single buck from the deep woods could feed him and his father for weeks if they prepared it right. Money. Imagine the price of pelt or antlers such as those could fetch. And there was something about this place. It seemed to whisper to Peck, "You don't belong here." And that only made him wish to explore it all the more. The 2 forces battling in Peck's mind were at a stalemate, and so he continued walking between the known and the unknown. And something in the unknown walked with him. He was only slightly aware of it at first. It never made a sound. But out of the corner of his eye, he would see movement. And every time he looked, he would see only the trees, the underbrush, and nothing more. There were no animals to be seen on that day. And as the sun set, Peck could feel a dread beginning to overcome him. Any sense of adventure or urgency to provide for his aging father were far from his mind as soon as the shadows began to lengthen. He did not dare stay in the old woods after nightfall again. He gathered kindling and started a fire. He continued to watch the tree line, and as far away as he was, could still feel that he was being watched. Was he paranoid? Surely it was nothing. He drank from his water skin and pulled a piece of dried venison from his satchel. Peck's paranoia bore fruit, as his fears were confirmed. A pair of eyes glowed beyond the flames of his campsite. Peck stood and seized his bow, quickly nocking an arrow. The wolves must have returned. They must have smelled the meat in his satchel. Then, the light from the eyes spread upward. It formed into waving lines like tree branches. They spread out and illuminated the tree line. Peck's eyes grew wide. It could have been described as a deer by some stretch of imagination. But the limbs were too long, too thin. The antlers were larger than most mule deer, twice its size, and the pale green light emanating from it was almost akin to a firefly's glow, and its eyes were unnaturally large. The 2 stared at one another, unmoving, for hours. The adrenaline in his blood would not allow Peck to even look away from the thing. His fire died down, smoldering into glowing coals, then fading completely. But by the light of those eyes and antlers, he could still see his pursuer. So remained the two, motionless, for hours. Peck gripped the bow and arrow tightly, his knuckles white. It looked, for all intents and purposes, like a deer. Peck hunted deer, had killed more of them than he could recall. If he wished, he could loose an arrow upon this creature, pierce it through the heart without exertion. But as his thoughts moved him, pulling his arrow back, preparing to loose, the thing changed. Its antlers grew longer, twisting and curling upon themselves in ways Peck could hardly have described. The green glow became deeper, darker. Mesmerized, Peck lowered his bow slightly, but his grip did not loosen. The curling of the horns ceased, and all was still again. Peck and the thing simply stared at each other, unmoving, until the sun peeked through the orange leaves of the trees. By the light of the early sun, Peck was finally able to see all of the creature. Its length was covered in a green moss which hung from the sides and nearly dragged on the forest floor. Patches of fur were visible underneath the moss in some places. The tail was long, resembling more a wolf's tail than that of a deer. As the light struck the deer thing, it was as though it came to life. It looked to one side and opened its mouth wide in a yawn. Peck could see its jaws were lined with sharp, pointed teeth. It turned and walked away, leaving Peck alone and exhausted. He dropped the bow to the ground and slumped against the tree. He shuddered as the stag disappeared from his view. But its eyes, he could still see its eyes staring at him, like it knew him, knew why he was there. Its eyes were there in his mind when he stood to leave. They were still there when he stepped into the old forest once again, still there at midday when he finally caught his sight of a deer. A normal deer, that is. Peck crouched behind a tree when he saw the huge creature. The stories were exaggerated, to be fair. It was large, but not the tree-sized beast he had been led to believe. But even so, it was enormous. The antlers would fetch a great price, as would the flawless pelt, fit for a king. The pelt seemed to shimmer in the midday sun, like gold it was. Truly beautiful. Rosebush was only 1.5 miles from here. He could easily make that distance with the deer, providing it didn't run too far. He nocked an arrow silently and pulled back the bowstring. The stag's ears perked up, and it raised its head in his direction. He loosed the arrow. A true shot as the arrow struck the deer near the heart. There was a momentary spurt of blood upon the moment of impact. The buck fled, and Peck's heart sank as it bolted further into the woods. He hesitated, then ran after it. A trail of blood quickly led Peck to his quarry. Luckily, it had only made it about 300 feet from where he had shot it. He knelt beside the beast and drew his knife. The creature still breathed, slowly and laboriously. Slowly, it lowered its head to the ground with a low bellow. And Peck took the moment to quickly open its neck with his blade. The blood covered the ground around Peck in a matter of seconds, and in a moment more, the deer was still. Peck sighed and sat back on his haunches. He ran his blood-covered hands through his hair. It was over. He would prepare the kill, remove the innards, and carry the deer to the forest edge. He would load it up onto Rosebush, take it to town, smoke the meat. Then he would turn his heel to this place and never return. It was over. It would be easy to follow one of the caravans between Kirkhannen and Bridgewater, just as he had done on the way here. He would soon be home. In only perhaps 3 days at most, he would be home. Peck gripped his knife a little more tightly as he silently hoped his father still fared well. Or at least as well as when he had left. He slid his knife down the length of the deer's belly, along with perpendicular cuts as needed to open the chest cavity. His knife moved on its own, making all the other cuts needed. He was surgical, precise. This was what he knew. This was his trade, his work, his worship. He removed all the innards, casting them aside. They would only weigh him down and would not be worth the price they would fetch. But as he removed the heart, old traditions stayed his hand. Hunting trips with his father, the sage's prayers for vitality and bravery, the taste of blood and flesh. He removed a cloth from his satchel and wrapped up the heart, stowing it beside his other belongings. If there was anything Peck desired in this moment, it was bravery. He still felt tense, and would as long as his feet remained in this forest. With an expert hand, Peck cut tendons, sinew, and flesh to make the large deer easier to remove from the old woods. He bound the legs such that the deer could be carried as a makeshift knapsack, albeit a very large, heavy, and unwieldy knapsack. Peck squatted and lifted the remains of the deer onto his back. The blood seeped almost immediately through his shirt and onto his skin, sticking the cloth to his flesh. Had he been anywhere else, he would have allowed more time to let the blood drain. That was not an option. Exerting himself, he stomped his way back toward the edge of the old woods, moving as quickly as he could back along the blood trail. It was done. He would soon be home, in his own bed. He smiled to himself from under the load. Home, with his father. And, hopefully, a bit richer than when he had left. His thoughts were severed immediately, as he saw that something stood in his path. He looked up, and nearly screamed as he saw it again. Even in broad daylight, the eyes shone a sickly green. Its head was bowed to the forest floor, tongue lapping at the dead deer's blood. He stepped back, the weight of the load on his shoulders nearly causing him to fall to the ground. The creature lifted its head to look at him. Its face was stained red, and blood dripped from the corners of its mouth. It stared at him, almost expectantly. "What do you want from me?" he roared at it. The deer seemed to grow taller, looming over him. A high-pitched shriek emanated from its mouth, devolving into a low-pitched bellow. Peck dropped the kill to the ground and drew his bow, deftly nocking an arrow and letting it fly directly into the deer thing's skull. It struck the thing in one of its glowing green eyes. Peck tensed for a moment, unsure if his arrow had landed. He lowered his bow when he saw he had placed it well, but a moment too soon. The head swiveled back to stare at him. Starting where the arrow's shaft met the eye, the wood rotted, then crumbled and fell to the earth. Where it fell, the wood continued to rot. Then sprouts grew from the rot, and in the span of only a few seconds had grown nearly a hand's length in height. Blood, if it could be called that, dripped from the wounded eye, where the arrowhead was still visible. It was a black liquid, but was blood-like in consistency. It shimmered in the sunlight, giving off an oil-like sheen. Peck furrowed his brow. He was obviously seeing things, just as with the night before. But the creature had survived an arrow to the eye and continued to walk toward him. Peck fired a second arrow into the beast's neck. Still, it walked, again dripping the same black liquid from the wound. A third arrow flew into its chest. It did not even flinch. Each arrow simply rotted and fell from the deer's hide. Peck was incredulous, but still it advanced, its eyes burning like green fire. Its jaws opened, showing once again the pointed teeth of a predator, stained in blood. What was this thing? A monster? A god? Peck did not know. In his eyes, the only sensible thing to do was to run. And so he ran with all of his strength, leaving his kill behind, running deeper into the old woods. Peck collapsed after several hours of running deeper into the forest. He had lost all bearings, but he had also lost sight of the being that pursued him. He clutched his satchel close, thanking his good sense to have kept it in his flight. All around him were only the enormous trees, covered in autumnal shades of leaves. The sun painted the dusk sky a brilliant orange in the gaps in the foliage above him. He crawled, exhausted, into the cradling roots of a tree. If a predator found him, he would not be able to fight back this time. He was too exhausted. But even the thought of the wolves and the bears did not fill him with as much terror as the green-eyed thing. He could not help but sleep for a few moments. And his dreams, once again, took him back home, back to his father on one of their hunts. He watched his father, who held a bow in his hand. To Peck's eyes, he looked majestic, like Arishen, the legendary hunter of old. His father loosed an arrow with precision, and the dream immediately took them to the bloody site of the kill. It was wrong, though. This pelt, it was the deer Peck had killed. The pelt gleamed like hairs of silver and gold. His father had already prepared the deer, removed the organs, and had begun carving off chunks of the flank. "Father, what are you doing?" Peck asked. His voice sounded like that of a child. "Give to the forest that which it is due. It has allowed you to hunt here today. Honor the woods, so that we may be allowed to return to hunt again." Peck recalled his father saying such things. He left a part of the meat to the wolves and the bears and the raccoons. And even then, Peck could only think of the waste. They could have used that meat. They could have eaten another day with what was left to the woods. His thoughts echoed through the glade as though he had spoken them aloud. His father's figure froze. He slowly stood, his frame measuring nearly twice Peck's size. His father turned to face him, seizing him by the arms. Terrified, Peck saw his father's face, covered in a shadow obscuring his features. "Honor the woods." He watched as his father's figure warped, branches sprouting out from his chest and head, becoming the tree under which he slept, its bark slick with a black, oily fluid. His father's hands became tree roots, the tips puncturing Peck's chest, reaching for his heart. He felt the blood slowly draining out of him, flowing down the length of the roots, and the branches above his head slowly began to descend, taking the shape of a pair of antlers, and the glowing green eyes opened from underneath them. He started awake when he realized the trees around him had grown silent. The crickets did not chirp. And from deeper in the forest, the glowing form of the stag emerged. It did not run, did not gallop. It only walked on its unnaturally long legs, then stopped a few paces from where Peck lay, too worn out to move. A long tongue slipped out from its mouth as it cleaned the wound on its chest. The wound to its eye and neck appeared to have healed completely. It stood once again motionless in expectation. Peck croaked out a threat. "You stay right there." He attempted to stand, but was too weak to move farther than a few paces. The glowing eyes followed him. He fell on his back, looking up at the branches of the tree from his nightmare. The creature loomed over him, the eyes staring directly into his. Its mouth parted slightly, showing those teeth once again. His lips peeling back into a grimace, Peck reached at his belt and seized his knife. With all of his remaining strength, he threw the knife directly at the glowing eyes, and missed. The blade sailed through the air and thudded against the trunk of the tree under which he had rested. The apparition bellowed in what sounded to be pain. Peck flinched as a drop of black liquid fell on his face from a fresh wound on the thing's chest. Peck hesitated a moment. He hadn't hit the creature. He had hit the tree. Cutting the tree had somehow cut it as well. He quickly pushed himself out from under the deer and sought out the knife by the light of the antlers. He found it, embedded only shallowly in the bark of this tree. Turning to face his pursuer, Peck seized the knife and plunged it once again into the bark of the tree. The beast's form warped and grew, blood pouring out from another fresh wound. Maddened by anger and exhaustion, Peck ripped and tore at the bark of the tree, taking a grim satisfaction from the screams of his pursuer. Finally, a bloody deer fled from the sight, its shrieks fading into the distance. Peck fell to his knees, knife still in hand. He looked upward at the tree. In the dark, he could not distinguish anything extraordinary about this tree. Its bark was rough and thick, like that of an oak, but he could just barely see by the moonlight that the bark was white, and the place where he had cut into the flesh of the tree dripped with the same black, oily blood. What was the creature that had stalked him? Was it some beast unknown to the world outside these woods, thriving off this abundant place? Was he delirious, hallucinating the whole thing? Or was this some god of the old woods, a spirit of the forest? Peck stared out into the woods. What could he do? He could stay here. Eventually the creature would return. Then what? Continue stabbing the tree until it leaves again? What if that didn't work the next time? Run? He wasn't sure exactly which way to go. And what if it found him again as he ran? He was exhausted, likely dehydrated. He felt dizzy, to be sure, and his mouth felt dry. His water skin had run dry hours ago. He was not sure how far he would be able to run in his state. Peck ran a hand along the tree. A god of the forest it might be, but one that felt pain, and that meant it could be killed. He snorted. A god that felt pain did not sound much like a god to him. Peck dug through his satchel, tossing aside the empty water skin, then removed the tinderbox. He must be mad. Setting the tree ablaze, likely dooming the whole forest. And perhaps even this would not be enough to kill the stag. But it would at least give him time to reach the edge of the old wood. The screams of the forest god followed Peck as he stumbled his way through the woods. The trees behind him ignited quickly, their dried leaves making good kindling for the roaring inferno. The white tree had burned easily, the black liquid acting like pitch. As it burned, Peck thought he could hear the tree itself crying out. The cries sounded to his ears like an amalgamation of a bear's groans, a wolf's howl, an elk's bellow, and dozens of other animals rolled into one. Like the entire forest cried along with this tree. The tree had been consumed all too quickly by the flames, and Peck had been forced to flee immediately as it spread to the other trees. As he fled through the woods, he saw all manner of creatures fleeing from the blaze, many appearing like animals he knew, but much larger. The deer he had killed was dwarfed in comparison to those he saw fleeing the fire. They ignored him in their blind panic to escape the flames. He ran as quickly as his exhausted body would allow. Behind him, he could see something pursuing him. The stag, a flame, wildly thrashing and charging toward him. Peck stumbled over a fallen log and, horrified, found that he had cornered himself in a ravine. The walls were low enough that he could climb them, but the shrieks of the burning god sounded behind him. Peck whipped around. The thing's eyes were wide, but not out of fear. The eyes blazed with a surprised indignation. The god stamped its hooves, drawing closer. It gestured with its head toward the satchel Peck still carried with him. Peck reached down into his satchel, confused, and removed the deer's heart, still wrapped in the bloody cloth. The god demanded sacrifice, demanded its offering. It had allowed him into its forest, had allowed him to hunt, and now it demanded that which it was owed. Give the forest that which it is owed. Peck stared at the heart. You want me to give sacrifice to you? As though you were a god? But Peck knew no gods. He worshipped no deity. His only tithes were to his father. His only idols were his own 2 hands. And so, in defiance, Peck threw the heart into the roaring flames of the old woods. The creature followed the heart with its eyes, its screams silenced for a moment. Why should I worship a god who bleeds? When the creature looked at Peck again, its eyes had lost all glow. In their place was an endless black void. Even with the blinding flames around them, the area around the deer had grown terribly dark. Peck reached into what little reserves of energy he still possessed and fled. He clambered up the rocks and sprinted. The god's screams were replaced with a low bellow, a roar that mimicked the flames. Peck's legs were burning, his lungs bursting, his throat hoarse and his breath a rasp. And after what seemed an eternity of pushing his frame to the very ends of its strength, looking constantly over his shoulder for a glimpse of the thing, he stumbled out into a meadow on the other side of the old forest. Peck felt a deep, shuddering laugh overcome him. He turned to look at the forest behind him, enveloped in flames. The deer was nowhere to be seen. It was done. He had escaped. He fell to the earth, unconscious. Peck sat beside his father, holding a bowl. The sage, in whom his father trusted so much, had taken the antlers of the buck and ground them into a powder, then made them into a paste with herbs and berries. Peck stared at it. It was useless, a combination of inert ingredients. But it was for his father's faith that he tolerated the superstitions. His father did look better today. His face had more color, his eyes more lucid. He spoke more often. "What did you see in the old wood?" he asked. Peck furrowed his brow, stifling the memories as much as he could. It was... The trees grew tall, so much taller than... I've seen the trees of the old wood, Peck. What did you see? Peck looked at his father. His father sat up, slowly. I taught you, Peck. I told you to honor the woods. A hand grasped Peck's arm. You did no such thing. You stole, cut, burned. Peck struggled to loosen his father's hand, but found the grip to be like iron. He attempted to stand, but could not free himself. The bowl clattered to the floor. Give the forest that which it is owed. Peck struggled, but his eyes were fixed on his father's face. Another hand reached out to grasp Peck's shoulder. A third hand reached out from behind his father, clasping around his throat. Another burst through his father's chest and gripped his shirt. More and more arms latched onto him, transfixing him in place. Hands tore at his chest, tearing fabric, flesh, pulling at bone and sinew. The forest will claim that which it is owed. Peck stared down, horrified, as a hand wrapped itself around his heart. He looked again into the face of his father. Flames burned behind those once gentle eyes, and soon the flames consumed his frame as well. Bubbling, burning, hissing, charring. Skeletal hands, charred and smoldering, held him tightly. The forest will claim that which it is owed. Peck shot awake, sitting up straight. A shape lumbered out from the blazing ruins of the old forest. Peck shook his head. No, you can't still be alive. The deer stumbled forward. Its skin was burnt, and as it walked, the flesh sloughed off of the bone, leaving the skull bare and dripping with blood. Peck knew better than to feel relieved at the state of the creature. It was still very much alive. The deer, now a skeletal figure, continued walking toward him. "No," Peck whispered. The deer's skull began to twist, contort, and reshape itself. Fangs grew down further in place of the teeth. Claws extended outward where the hooves had been. The glowing antlers remained, the sickly green color in stark contrast to the orange flames. And in place of the glowing green eyes were two smoldering green flames, floating in the empty void of the eye sockets. "No!" Peck screamed. The forest god seized Peck's leg in its skeletal jaws and dragged him, screaming, back into the old woods.